I am not the person who's in your program. I'm Jessica Berman. I'm the director of the Drescher Center for the Humanities at UMBC. And I am not the person who's in your program, and I'm not from Venice, though I wish I were in Venice. Baltimore is not quite Venice. And I just want to say a quick thanks once again to the CHCI board and to Debjani for running just a really wonderful few days of conference. And as I've been saying, I mean, not a glitch, really not a glitch. And last night's dinner at the Vineyard, if you weren't there, you wish you were. It was gorgeous and really showed us what Virginia can be, I think. I'm very pleased to be introducing Michael Whitworth today, who has served as the director of the Folger Shakespeare Library since 2011. As faculty at a university that holds membership in the Folger Institute, I know that many of our scholars across several departments benefit regularly from the use of the Folger's collections and from its seminars and fellowships. And several of our students have been Folger interns, and it's launched them on all kinds of academic and alt-ac careers. So it's a little known, wonderful service of the Folger. I'm also a neighbor of the Folger. We've just discovered we live a couple blocks away. And a longtime subscriber to the Folger Theater. So I know firsthand how crucial the Folger is as a beacon for humanities work in the Washington, D.C. area. It's where my kids saw their first Romeo and Juliet, and where they got to eat cake with Queen Elizabeth on Shakespeare's birthday. And I bet you didn't know, they bring her back from the dead every year. But more seriously, the Folger plays an outside role not only in supporting and extending top-notch scholarship, but also in making the humanities visible to local theater audiences, to DC residents, to tourists, and increasingly under Michael's leadership, to the world. We all should be in awe of the resources they've made available on the web, and inspired by the aim and scope of Michael's vision for what the library can and should be. And he just said to me, we're opening it up, right? They're opening it up. I'm really looking forward to what he's going to talk to us about today. So just some background. Michael Witmore came to the Folger from a professorship in English at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Before that, he served as associate professor and assistant professor at Carnegie Mellon University. The recipient of numerous fellowships, he's held an Andrew Mellon postdoctoral fellowship at the University of California, Los Angeles, a research fellowship and a curatorial residency fellowship at the Folger, and a predoctoral fellowship at the Max Planck Institute in Berlin. Dr. Witmore is a deeply accomplished scholar in both traditional print and new media venues. In addition to numerous articles, website resources, and book chapters, he's published 5 books: Landscapes of the Passing Strange, Reflections from Shakespeare with Rosamund Purcell, Shakespearean Metaphysics, Pretty Creatures, Children and Fiction in the English Renaissance, Childhood and Children's Books in Early Modern Europe, and Culture of Accidents, Unexpected Knowledge in Early Modern Europe. At Carnegie Mellon, he organized the Pittsburgh Consortium for Medieval and Renaissance Studies, and at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, launched the Working Group for Digital Inquiry. He has been called, quote, a pioneer in the use of computers for digital analysis of the texts of William Shakespeare, calling our attention in particular to how digital analysis allows us to pay attention to exciting moves taking place at the level of the sentence. So here, the digital as a close reading tool rather than a distant reading tool. Check out his talk, Shakespeare from the Waist Down, fabulous title, which is archived at the Maryland Institute for Technology and the Humanities, or MITH website. It's really a great example of this. As I mentioned, at the Folger, he's led the push to create digital resources, including early modern manuscripts online, Shakespeare's World, a crowdsourced manuscripts project, Shakespeare Documented, free and searchable Folger digital texts of Shakespeare's plays and poems, a digital anthology of early modern English drama, and apps with a social reading platform for 7 of Shakespeare's most known plays. He currently has several has several books in progress, several, I'm putting an exclamation mark, including a study of early modern wisdom literature and a book on the nature of digital inquiry in the humanities. It's from this last project that I imagine he'll speak to us today on what should humanists think about in the age of the algorithm. Please join me in welcoming Michael Witmore.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be back in Charlottesville and to see so many friends and colleagues and to hear the conversation just from the last panel, which connects with things that I've certainly been thinking about for years in the work that I do. I'd like to thank the leaders of the CHCI for inviting me to speak today, especially Sarah Geyer and Debjani Ganguly and Craig Ely, who've been so gracious in extending an invitation to me to speak on this topic that feels both rich and urgent. The impact of the advances in genetics and informatics on humanistic inquiry is a topic of great depth, and it's certainly not one that I can even survey, much less exhaust today. In the remarks that I'm going to make, I would like to focus on a few examples within the area that I understand best, which is the area of the computer-assisted analysis of texts, mostly the texts of Shakespeare, but now many more. And over the next 40 minutes, I'd like to share some examples of the techniques that I have been using over the last 20 years, techniques that I began to understand when I taught at Carnegie Mellon for 10 years. Almost 10 years, a place where the ambient level of computational thinking is quite high. But then at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where I taught and worked with Sarah Geyer, a place where the Mellon Foundation helped fund a project called Visualizing Early English Print, and then subsequent work at the Folger. I am flattered that you could even entertain the idea that I'm writing 2 books. My working life actually keeps me further from that work, but being able to re-engage it and speak with you from a position of working at the intersection of scholarly work and public advocacy for the humanities, including, frankly, direct lobbying of the Congress to support the NEH, IMLS, and other state-sponsored funders of humanistic research, has given me an opportunity to think about some of these issues in different ways. I'd like to end by focusing on this question, but also on how some of the examples I'm about to present introduce features or problems that I think the humanities speak directly to, and places where we certainly need to be at the table and maybe even need to be conveners of conversations about how the resources of computing are being deployed in the study of culture, politics, inner life, poetics. So let's begin. I'm just going to tilt this so I can see what you're looking at. I wanted to begin with a 2016 Newsweek magazine article that reported that one of the leading figures in artificial intelligence research, Ray Kurzweil, has been or had been using algorithms to create a device that would be able to finish Shakespeare's sentences and even to some extent predict how Shakespeare would have answered questions on the Myers-Briggs personality test. Newsflash, he is an extrovert. The project offers a twist on the usual projects that we find AI working in, and some of which we were exploring in the last panel, identifying visual features so that we can sort, identify, and analyze subfeatures of text and images, sorting videos into genres, identifying nuclear test sites and image sets, identifying perceived threats in global warfare, policing language on chats, optimizing strategies for product delivery or market bets. There is a dizzying array of deployments of these technologies, including the one that you probably were thinking about in advance of this conference. Maybe you were, the deployment on Facebook of a very large and deep model of the behavior of voters, which at this point is still only available to a small subset of people who have an interest in that information and the meaning of that model. In all of these more familiar cases, AI is being marshaled to solve well-defined problems. For example, the case, and this is a classic, when a machine learns to beat a master player. For example, the Japanese strategy game Go. These are well-defined outcomes, and so optimizing or tuning an algorithm so that it progressively learns to solve that problem is easier to execute from an engineering standpoint. Kurzweil's Shakespeare simulator seems a bit different in this context, at least of what's gone before it. First and foremost, because Shakespeare is not a game with rules. And so one asks first, in what sense is Shakespeare trying to optimize anything or set of goals when he's writing plays for an early modern audience? Something that he did not do alone. He did it in collaboration with other playwrights. And in addition to whatever he was aiming at aesthetically, there were commercial drives involved. Kurzweil's project is provocative on a second level, since I think it winks at the widespread perception, and it's common, especially among scientists, that Shakespeare's literary output represents the peak of human creativity. Why not Gertrude Stein? As challengers to what we might call the Go master of drama, any machine that can imitate Shakespeare would appear to be on its way to conquering the arts and perhaps even mastering the humanities. Why the humanities? Well, because as soon as we agree that a machine has convincingly mimicked some distinctive form of literary creativity, we've passed judgment on that creativity. So Kurzweil's Shakespeare simulator is not trying to convince itself that it's the bard. It's trying to convince an audience, and that conviction or that judgment will be the product of criteria that come from the humanities. And here we get to one part of the problems that I think we'll end up circling around in this area, which is the ground truths or the domain expertise of humanities is essential to the creation of tools that seem to do automated work. You need someone, a Shakespeare professor or an audience member, to say, that's Shakespearean. I'd now like to turn to 3 examples that I've been thinking with as I try to understand this space and ask some questions that I think are still important to literary critics and certainly to me as a student of early modern culture. I want to begin with if, and, or but. One of the things that people do with computers is identify features which they would like to count and then subject those counts to analysis. You can count many different things. At Google, at the Translate team, they started by trying to count YouTube frames that had pictures of cats in them. The face of a cat then became the feature that needed to be identified and optimized. But you can pick anything. And this is a base level illustration of the need for interpretation in any iterative humanities computational project. You have to pick some features to count. And so for the purposes of argument, I wanted to pick 3 words in Shakespeare: if, and, or but, and then place his plays in a 3-dimensional if, and, or but space, which I'm about to show you. But the procedure is explainable. That is, take 36 plays of Shakespeare from the Folger digital texts. We stripped off the speech prefixes, the stage directions, and then counted for every play how many times each play used the words if, and, or but. This is 36 Shakespeare plays in a 3-dimensional if, and, or but space. What that means is that the percentage of the total number of words in that play that are if, and, or but are represented on 3 axes here. And so on the if axis, you have one position for a percentage, the and you have another, and the but you have a third. And that places you in the space. We can see 3 dimensions. Once you go higher than 3, it's harder. But I wanted to show you this picture because it allows you to have a geometric intuition of some of what's happening in this kind of analysis. A 3-dimensional space is well understood mathematically. And there are ways of drawing a line through this space to try to separate certain kinds of texts from others. And that's where the art of creating classifiers in machine learning really shows what it's capable of. But I just wanted to show you this picture because I've color-coded, again, humanities domain expertise, the catalog page of the first folio sorts the plays by genres. And those three labels are very powerful. They encompass a huge amount of information that's derived from the historic perceptions of two friends of Shakespeare who understood the rhythms and the conventions of early modern professional theater. So, without rotating this illustration, I think I'll ask you to trust me, but we can rotate it after I finish. What you can see from this diagram is that the red dots, which represent comedy, sit in a different place in that space from the green dots, which represent Shakespeare's history plays. Now, if you look at that distribution from a statistical point and say, to what degree is it mere chance that these two seem not to overlap? The answer is, it really doesn't seem like chance. There's a strong statistical significance to the sorting power of these three features, if and or but. And if you count them and you put the plays in a space on those three axes, you get essentially clouds of the plays that are separate with reference to genre. Now, I didn't tell anybody what the comedies were or the histories were. All of that metadata is suppressed. That's on the catalog page of the first folio. These are just counts of the three words. So why would that be? We move, as soon as we leave that picture, we've identified three features. We've talked about their distribution. We've characterized where they sit in the space. And now's the moment for a humanities move, which often is invisible or accomplished by sleight of hand in computational circles. We're going to link those features to a statement about what they are a proxy for. And this basic move of feature, proxy, I think these three words in their distribution are a proxy for genre. So that plays, and here's the distribution. Plays having more and tend to lack if or but and tend to be what we think of as the history plays. Conversely, plays having lots of if and but tend to lack and. They tend to be what we think of as comedies. So I would treat those as two descriptive statements. I don't think there's interpretation yet, because now you have to say why, motivate those relationships. So if you're telling a story about courtship, and this is my interpretation that I've added after looking at examples of this pattern, you're going to be staging a drama of conditions, that is reticence or confusion, longing, and in order to sustain for 4 acts that erotic dialogue between two people who kind of understand each other but also misunderstand each other and frankly can't understand each other till Act 5, you're going to need people qualifying their statements. The erotic feints and qualifications which hedge vulnerability will require the actor to use words like if or but. And since all the action is on stage rather than off stage, they don't use and, which is a feature of history plays. Well, why would that be? Well, if you're going to tell in 2 hours traffic the story of armies in succession, you can't show the vasty fields of France, as the prologue to Henry V says. You have to report it. And so history plays, this is one way of picking them out of a hat, but there are many others. This is just a brute force way. In order to conduct the dramaturgy, no flashbacks, 12 people, to tell that kind of story, you're going to have a speaker come up and say, and then the King of France did this, and then they did this, and then, and then, and then. And is a proxy for reported events in a dramaturgy of a small professional working company. So I've given you an example of how to count something, how it shows up in space, and then how a curious literary critic would try to interpret that. And I think very important to this process is that it doesn't really make sense until you come up with examples. And I think that's what makes us humanists. If you sent an anthropologist to an English, to the MLA, to the conference, and said, what are those people doing? I think the anthropologists would say, well, they're very interesting, they're passionate about books, and they seem to trade these examples, which are short passages from speeches. And you can identify an expert or insider in that social group by the number of people who nod when they introduce their example. And then you notice that the example is iterated and shared. Because for people like us, examples capture a vast amount of complexity. There's a high level of implicit comparison in an example, and they scale well. Because I pointed an example, and if you recognize it, you grasp the comparisons that are behind it. So in this speech, I'm going to illustrate the comic pattern from the end of As You Like It. This is Rosalind managing the final triple recognition scene. And to do so, she has to make multiple if statements. And we'll see that in a number of comedies, whether it's about managing the deception or doing the emotional hedging that's required to protect vulnerable but erotically charged partners in dialogue. I did want to show you this picture, though, because this is a return to the one I showed you before. That blue dot up near the comedies is Othello. And that's an interesting question. From the standpoint of this metric, this interpretation of the features, Othello behaves a lot like a comedy. About 30 years ago, a critic named Susan Snyder actually wrote about that and said Othello seems to be a tragedy that's built on the theatrical conventions of comedy, and what's happening in Act 3 is that the two individuals who are in courtship, Othello and Iago, reach the height of that courtship, and that particular interchange is executed along the conventions of comedy. So once we go back to the example and start looking at how ifs are working in this dialogue, now this is an assisted look at that passage. I've used the prosthetic of a brute force counting of Shakespeare's plays to say if is quite interesting, especially in erotic courtship. Now let's go to that passage. You see the ifs that Othello is deploying and Iago is echoing are about heightening the hypothetical imagination and anxieties of a listener who needs to be driven toward an erotic conclusion. You need if to do that. So one of the ways of redescribing Shakespeare's genre moves in Othello would be to say that not only is comedy the genre of if, but, and very little and, but it's a tendency that Shakespeare deploys to new ends when he wants to produce an effect that is the opposite of comedy, that is revolting misogyny and misjudgments. That's probably part of why the play has that effect. I want to move on to a second example. This is a set of illustrations that are created using a technique called word to Veck. That's a word embedding technique that was invented by the team at Google Brain, which was working on the translation problem, and which eventually led to this step change in the effectiveness of the Google Translate algorithm. I'll explain a little bit about how it works, and then I'll show you two results, again, connecting it with passages from Othello. But computationally, what's happening is there are 60,000 works that have been made fully searchable in the early English Books Online project. They span roughly from 1475 to 1700. What word2vec does is take every sentence, every word, number, symbol, in those 60,000 works, and it arranges them into a very, very long line of text. Then millions and millions of times, it reaches into that very long line randomly and grabs a 10-word sequence. And then it asks itself what words are co-occurring with one another in that sequence. So as you can imagine, it's got a vocabulary of every word in that corpus, but the samplings are now taking some of those words and pulling them closer together. They draw closer together in the abstract space that I'll be showing you because they co-occur more often. So there's a variety of genres in this corpus. It's politics, it's lists, it's warfare, it's science, it's poetry. It's sometimes correspondence. It is a fairly broad sampling of what made it into print in that early century and a half of print in England. But it's showing you what kinds of words people tend to use around other words. So that's the first thing to understand. The second, and I'll make reference to that three-dimensional space I showed you before, is that, as you can imagine, any training set will bias a classifier or model because it transmits the biases of the people and culture who created them. So within this abstract space that's being created, there are what looks like axes. Think of a kind of a ball of yarn and putting a knitting needle through the ball in any number of directions you could try, but there's certain directions which tend to array the words in that dimension along axes that we would recognize, like gender, confession, so religious affiliation, race and geography, and class. Just pause at that because that's interesting. What it's saying is that certain words are going to draw close together because they're used with one another. If they have similarity because they're perceived as similarly with respect to gender, there could be a dimension on which they seem to be right next to each other, even when from another perspective, they seem to have nothing to do with each other. So let me, this is a quotation from Gideon Lewis Krauss, who wrote a very interesting article about the Google Translate project in the New York Times. It's lucid, it's entertaining, but I would recommend it to you. But in this quotation, he's saying, I'm looking for vicinities of words on the assumption, at least for those who created this algorithm, that a word means the neighborhood in which it lives. That's what its meaning is. And saying, you know, there are places to look in these models for different kinds of similarity and proximity. Okay. This is one of those axes in a corpus that's the entire roughly 60,000 texts that are in the EBO TCP corpus. And I want to make sure you can see this. But to the left, so there are two axes here, and think about these as these found directions in a model that has not just 3 dimensions now, but 200. And what you're seeing here is a shadow projection of that 200-dimensional space from two very interested perspectives that motivate the projection. So on the x, left and right, we've found a direction. Essentially what we've said to the model is go to the place where the words malice, disgrace, cruelty, falsehood, ingratitude, lust, and envy live. Find the midpoint between all those items in the model, and then stretch across the model to the midpoint between merit, goodness, virtue, wisdom, prudence, nobleness, perfection, generosity, and merit. These are interpretive choices that I made because I, knowing the period, know that these words tend to oppose one another. But if you find those 2 points, it's then going to take a series of words. I've asked it to use words that are connected with race and nationality and array them along that axis. Does that make sense? So nouny things behave in very interesting ways once you start to look at these spaces. On the left, I'm going to use the shorthand and say that's vices, and on the right, on the x, is virtues. Now, male and female on the y-axis, so he and his for male, she and hers for female. Again, my choices because I think those will capture some form of variance in the model. So now what the model does is it says, I now have a cloud of words that tends to hang out with each other because they represent ethnicity and geography, and now I want to stretch them along these 2 axes. I find this an interesting visualization because as someone who still thinks a lot about Othello, I'm starting to see some of the racist underpinnings of early modern culture which are being projected through Shakespeare's handling of Othello's insider and outsider status. But what we're seeing here is a set of associations that are not just in Shakespeare, but are in thousands and thousands and thousands of early modern texts. So in general, if you look at the extreme corners, there's actually some linearity here. So the more male you are, the more likely you are to be associated with vice as a nationality. The more female, the more likely virtues. But pirate, Turk, and Jew, upper left on the vice side, male, and then moving down to the other extreme lower right, Italians, the Spanish, the French, being treated as female. And that's also a resonance that one can see, certainly in Shakespeare's plays, the feminization of Southern European peoples as a way of emphasizing English masculinity is one of those overtones that you hear if you've read a lot of early modern texts. I don't know if this is a substitute for having read a lot of early modern texts. I don't think so. But it's interesting because it shows us that an instance that we've observed in an example, such as Shakespeare, is part of a much larger rhetoric or discourse that we can, through sampling, show to be active on a much larger scale. Is that new humanities knowledge? Yeah, I think so. I think it confirms something that critics like Patricia Parker and Kim Hall and Ayanna Thompson have been saying about Othello for a long time. But it also gives us nuance and a continuum to explore so that it's not just a picture of how the Moor is treated, how the Turk is treated, how the Christian is treated, but a whole synoptic look at nationalities and regions. So let me give you one other from Othello. Through the courtship, as Othello and Iago are working through this if structure, if I could only supervise and see these two coupling, which is the circuit that closes Othello's anxious imagination, and immediately his mind turns to the animal world. And I think this connects to your earlier comment about animals and how they become enmeshed in cultural forms of explanation. Here, on this axis in the model, Christ and Christian are the keywords that are the point on the leftmost axis. And then Turk, infidel, a series of words that are obviously non-Christian in the context of this period, again, selected by me. Male and female, the same as the other one. So some of what I see in this visualization is confirming things that I've already seen, which is that the lamb, in Christian rhetoric, symbol of imminence, of innocence, on the female side, and Christ, cow, I'm not as sure about, and I don't understand. I don't understand that. Upper right, non-Christian and hyper-male goat. Lower right, non-Christian and feminized monkey. When Iago deploys the rhetoric that he uses to activate Othello's imagination, both about fantasies of Venetians, fantasies about women's, and fantasies about insiders and outsiders, his rhetoric is then echoed by Othello. So Iago, this is 3-1, or 3-3, is having Othello entertain the hypothesis of this coupling of Cassio and Desdemona. And he lands on these two words, goats and monkeys. Later in Act 4, as Othello is interacting with Lodovico, the emissary, to say what's happening, he's already now almost clinched it with Iago, and they're, from a linguistic standpoint, they behave like a married couple. At that point, he starts to echo this opposition. So when I look at this model, it's suggestive to me because it's showing that not only in Othello, but perhaps in a much wider scale of texts, this opposition of goats and monkeys aligned with hypersexuality outside the bounds of Christianity is at work and would be intelligible to someone who heard it, not just in 1604 when the play was written, but for centuries afterwards. And again, I think the model is somewhat interesting, but the moment for me as a literary critic that feels more substantial is when I can actually start to see it working at the level of the sentence. Now, it would be a fair criticism to say, well, you're just making that up. You could have picked any number of other animals in Othello. And that is a fair criticism. When I show this kind of work to computer scientists, someone will eventually raise their hand and say, isn't the humanities like one big exercise in confirmation bias? To which the answer, I think, is yes, but it's motivated. It's motivated by ground truth perceptions of experts who are working with hundreds and hundreds of texts, who are very good at recognizing examples, and who are working in dialogue across cultures and across languages. But yeah. Okay. Now to translation. It really is extraordinary what happened in 2016 when Google Translate started to be able to work not only between tough language pairs, Chinese and English, but was able to take language pairs that it knew well, English, French, but if it had French to Javanese mapped as well, it could start translating English to Javanese, language pairs it had never studied. In order to do that, it had to build something like a meta-language, or what some would call an interlanguage or interlingual representation of how, not just words, how phrases and sentences in one language stack up and map against another. So just briefly, if you look at this representation in space, the principle that the engineers had in mind roughly in 2014, 15, and 16 was that if you created the same map in French, you would get a similar distribution of animals in that space, that they roughly map one another. They don't exactly map one another. But if you can imagine that process of creating this interlanguage that the Google engineers were engaged in, first they were creating what seemed like word-to-vec maps or vector embeddings for individual languages, including phrases and sentences. And then they were creating them from other languages, and they trained the algorithm on parallel sentences in the two languages, so that for French and English, it was the Canadian Parliament, which has thousands and thousands of pages of well-adjudicated human-generated translations. That starts to align the maps. Then for other languages, they would start with the top 1,000 words and align that map. Okay. So I'll show you a picture of one of those maps, but I also want to show you a picture of an experiment that I did with Jonathan Hope, who's a collaborator friend of mine. This is the to be or not to be speech. We sent a first folio open to this page to 50 states and 2 territories in 2016. 500,000 people lined up to see this speech, which means that even if Harold Bloom didn't say it already, that there's an iconic power, at least for this speech, for English speakers and within English literary history, as being exemplary of a certain type of inwardness. It's a shorthand caricature for something that is much bigger and much more widespread, but it seems to be one of those places that people point at when they think about what makes us modern, interior, non-corporate identities, as opposed to the identity of someone living in the feudal Middle Ages. So the experiment was to start with the English text, put it in Google Translate, make it translate into German. And this is the German translation, which is itself wobbly. For those of you reading it, it doesn't actually, so Schlegel put, das ist hier die Frage, and a touch that really a human could add. That's ignored in this translation. And then we took that German text and ran it back through Google Translate to get 2 English translations. I'm showing you one from a year ago and one from a couple days ago. And this is interesting. Let me say something that's not happening here. Google Translate has not gone and mapped, it hasn't gone into the corpus of Google Books and said, I've found a reliable German translation of that passage, and I recognize this as the same passage in English. I'm now going to substitute them. It's not doing that. It's taking sentences, words, phrases from the English and mapping them geometrically across this space in the interlingua to other points in a space that produce sentences that look like this. And that's interesting because this is a moment when translation is now also becoming a form of synthesis. If you think about the vast diversity of possible phrases in German, which Google Translate has seen, has disassembled, and could reassemble, the translation might be an attempt to point in the model to some other place that corresponds with the sentiment, but what it ends up reassembling could potentially look different, new, or accurately Shakespearean. So, being or not being. Google Translate must have read Heidegger between. It's quite interesting why it chose a year later to say, no, this is even more existential than you thought it was. Excuse me. Whether it's noble to suffer in the spirit, Geist, the slings and arrows of outrageous wealth, fortune, wealth substitution, or to take weapons armed against a sea of troubles, difficulties, and by resisting, end them. Great grammatical feature of the original speech. It's gone, but it's roughly getting it right. That was a tough syntactic thing to get. To die, to sleep, no more. And sleep is over, instead of, and by a sleep to say. Sorrow, 1,000 natural shocks. Nice. This meat is heritage. So, you know, what's going on here is we're seeing, frankly, for a purely mathematical model, this is a pretty good guess. So let's wait 10 years. Now, from a translation standpoint, it would be interesting to ask, what is it getting wrong and when? What are the areas in Shakespeare's writing, or in the text of any writer, that produce more misunderstanding, less intelligibility across languages, because there you're going to find history and culture. That's where it's going to be. So this is a model that the team built in the publication that really shared with the world what they were doing. It's 76 sentences that are arrayed in the interlingual model. And if you're the same sentence in multiple languages, not just words, sentences, you sit near each other in the model. And so B, that red cluster, is the sentence, the stratosphere extends from about 10 kilometers to about 50 kilometers in altitude. And next to it is a Korean sentence and a Japanese sentence, which are, by a human translator, identified as being semantically accurate translations. The color coding in C now breaks apart that cluster and shows you the three languages at work. But this, I think, is interesting because it starts to tell us that a number of languages are being mapped onto one another, and that there are going to be places where the translations are either inaccurate or there are movements that are taking place between words and phrases that have never been uttered by a human being before. The operations of translation are going to become more synthetic, and to the extent that they become more accurate, they're going to be incorporating more culture-specific bias and maybe also historical sensitivity to phrasal patterns from, say, oh, this is roughly turn of the 17th century English, and so I'll use this phrase. Back to Kurzweil. What Kurzweil was thinking then was, I will start to feed a model like that, built on English, with half sentences, two halves from the same writer, and I'm going to ask a neural network to guess when the two phrases are written by the same writer, and I will reward the neuron layer when it gets the right authors together. So labeled data, human domain judgments, and experts saying, these are both Jane Austen, these are both Shakespeare, thousands of examples, the neural network iterates through it. And that means that the neural network, when it sees to be or not to be, followed by that is the question, thinks Shakespeare. When it says to be or not to be and is offered the opportunity to say that a single man, that wonderful sentence from Austen, it says, I'm not excited by that. Those don't go together. And this is actually what that article in Newsweek was talking about. This is not a Shakespeare simulator. This is a phrase joiner. Now, if you trained this neural network with a lot more text, you could start to get more interesting results. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But it was on the basis of this matching, and the neural network cannot explain why those things go together. It just rates them as likely to go together. That matching was then deployed on the Myers-Briggs personality test. So it took a Myers-Briggs question, and it took the possible answers and it said, given what I know, which of these is more Shakespeare-like? It's clever. There is certainly some information in that model about what makes the pairing Shakespearean and not Austinian. But to the earlier paper's point, we can't open that box, especially if the model gets really good. And what we're going to want as humanists is examples. So this is, I think, the most important interface between the humanities and computational linguistics, text analysis, and search, is that human beings are excellent at looking at examples. And running machine algorithms that can match phrases and even generate new translations or stylistic matches for sentences written in one language is fine. It may convince English professors, which this would be the Turing test for the translation, is give me a translation of To Be or Not to Be into Hemingway's style that still feels Shakespearean. And then 20 English professors nod their heads and say, oh, they got it. Okay, the algorithm is doing some kind of effective work. But really, if there's humanities content in there, it's not going to be, this is what To Be or Not to Be looks like if it was written by Hemingway. Or frankly, if it was written by you, if we deployed this style detector on everything you've ever written. That might be an interesting existential moment to see your version of To Be or Not to Be, and maybe we should create that at the Folger for people who want to come try it on the website. But I don't think that's the answer. I think that what humanists are looking for, and it's not what Kurzweil is looking for, is a kind of mirror that will actually give us a sense of what we don't know and don't see about our own style. And I want to return to that at the end of this talk. But the quarry here is the unstatable fullness of what we mean when we use a word like Shakespearean. The practice of criticism that has been taking place over the last 200 years to try to define the meaning of that label is the continuous unfolding of an insufficient explanation of what that is, in more and more lucid and diverse terms. But you would not be satisfied if I said Shakespearean means the following ratio of if, and, or but in comparison to all other Renaissance writers. The example. What's the logical endpoint if Kurzweil keeps going? Perhaps it will be to start a Shakespeare sonnet and finish it. And if that happens and when it happens, there are all kinds of vertiginous questions to ask about what it means to convince a literary critic. We found this in a manuscript in the Folger vault. It looks Shakespearean. Do you agree? So if you get a yes to that question, have you really learned something new about Shakespeare? I think we'll start asking questions like that and thinking about things like that. But I don't think that just convincing people with new poems that look like old writers will really have the kind of depth that we want. So I'm going to offer my short answer to what we should think about in the age of the algorithm, partial and really a product of my own idiosyncratic journey through these techniques. Here are the three areas where I think the kind of complexity we work with in the humanities will survive the algorithmic turn and really and rightly be an object of interest and fascination for people who work with computation. The first is labels and descriptions. It is a very complex behavior to look at a particular writer's style and say, that is Gertrude Steinian, that is Achabian. Those judgments, the creation of those labels, is extraordinarily complex. And the amount of information that is in those labels is also extraordinary. I could ask you to explain what goes into your judgment in saying it looks like Chinua Achebe wrote this paragraph. But just like a black box algorithm, you probably will not be able to state the fullness of what you brought to that passage and the judgment that landed you there. Fascinating that humanities and literary criticism, at least, is a sustained conversation about things we can't really fully say. Second, that we have a passion for description and redescription of what we think we already know about writers. If I tell you that Shakespeare's histories are, in addition to being plays about dynastic succession, armies, etc., are plays that use a lot of and, I've offered you a redescription of a label. So machine learning and other techniques offer the possibility of the quantitative redescription of humanities judgments using criteria that we would never generate. And if they lead to new insights about how plays are built, what culture or subculture would have recognized that rhetorical pairing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, then I think they're of interest to us. And I also think that if you're an engineer creating a word embedding for a language, you need a humanist to explain that to you. In fact, if you really want to test the power of an algorithm, don't test parallel translations for their semantic accuracy. Start looking for the kinds of labelings and judgments that humanists do intuitively and try to understand it. Because it is an act of staggering complexity. Second, translation. I think in these examples, what we're seeing, we know, for example, in the translation of the Donation of Constantine by Lorenzo Valla, which really was a starting point for modern philology, that the attention to what kinds of words can or can't be used in certain sentences is a powerful basis for humanistic practice. And over the intervening years, I think translation has not received the attention it deserves, but which, again, as a phenomenon and a cultural problem, has great depth and complexity, great context sensitivity, and could benefit from the kind of exploration and parallel inquiry that happens on the level of lingual models of languages. I don't think perhaps you would accept a judgment from Google Translate about whether your own translation of a passage is good or bad. That's metaphysical. But understanding where our languages do and don't align and how the kind of connotative halo of certain words around animals, around types of ships, around regions, around virtues, around ethnicities, around religious confessions, that particular spread, as it varies from language to language, is extremely interesting. And it's something that cultural studies, studies of rhetoric, have been drawing our attention to for decades. I think Raymond Williams would have loved to be able to use these tools. Finally, examples. we use examples to describe and caricature enormous amounts of comparisons that we do as readers. And that has to be the case because there is a high level, I'm going to move to a set of recommendations, there's a high level of tacitness in the head nodding that goes on at humanities conferences. Knowing when to nod your head means I share the tacit knowledge with you. It's another way of actually saying I share bias with you. So whatever the behavior is that's going on in literary studies where we're having these complex reactions to passages and comparisons, it is a subspecies of a much broader set of behaviors in which people either know or don't know what is stated in a comparison or a rhetorical flourish. It's the tacitness that is interesting to me. So in the spirit of, I don't often quote Aquinas, but Aquinas says, the big questions are what can we know, what should we hope for, and what should we do? Here are some thoughts about that for the humanities. Our to-do list. I think from my perspective, one is that we should become problem factories. We already are, but we should pose difficult problems for machine learning communities. For example, early modernists believed that a form of possessive individualism developed over the course of the 17th century in which individuals started to claim their inner lives as the greater authority as opposed to their corporate belonging in feudal and community structures. This leads to a differentiation between the public sphere, which has a more standard set of vocabularies and interests, and a private sphere, which is noticeably different. That's a humanities ground truth. That's also the kind of problem that a text analytic engineer needs to work on. And I do think that the sciences and engineering have a certain kind of confidence and bias in the positionless space that they work from and occupy in terms of history and culture. But when I meet computer scientists and they say, oh, you're from the humanities, usually the first thing they say is, oh, we're just waiting for humanities collaborators who can give us great problems. But we don't have the relationships, and it's often hard to settle on a question. But if you're running on a humanities center, you have the ability to programmatically lay out certain questions and convene communities and force conversations about difficult areas in the study of history, culture, and politics. And I think that the Googlers of the world, and you have to decide how much to engage and what's at stake in the engagement, but I do think that there is an interest in specifically the kind of complexity we work with every day and which we teach our students to recognize. So that's to-do list one. To-do list two is, well, what is going to happen when we start working together with algorithms whose principles of selection and output we cannot understand? Because it's already happening. And a whole set of questions about the relationship between the humanities and our access to politics, to discussions and to decisions about the economy, to, for example, the Google debate internally recently about whether they're going to end their contract with a military contractor because they're deploying powerful resources from artificial intelligence in the service of the search for targets. Those are problems that require political analysis, advocacy, of the kind we're familiar with in the humanities. But in the long term, I think the question is, who's training those algorithms? What data sets are they looking at? What's being optimized? We should give the algorithms a humanities education. And we should keep teaching humanities to human beings. And if we need to have a debate about how human beings and algorithms deliberate in a joint parliamentary system, then we need a Robert's Rules of Order for human-robot parliaments. But we need to think about that, and that's something that humanists can think about. Finally, the kinds of questions that still feel important to me. Exemplarity, I think, becomes the shared problem space between the humanities and computational research. That's because of its complexity. And when I was at Carnegie Mellon and I met statisticians who said, I have algorithms that can sort things in the evening sky, that can work on weather, but I've never encountered a problem as complex as the ones we see in the humanities. You know, come on over to our side of the quad. We have a problem space that's interesting and powerful. Second, redescription becomes part of our critical process. And I tried to allude to the fact that as humanists, we are already looking for alternative descriptions and perspectives on what seems to count as knowledge in our disciplines. There is no reason to refuse a priori a set of descriptions that's produced by a machine. 3, the line between translation and analysis is going to become harder to draw because underneath analytic tasks, at least computationally, translation is at work. And I'm probably not the right person to say it, but I think that translation has been a problem in comparative literature departments. It needs to be a globally vital question. And I believe that the more and more we engage with people in the community of AI, the more pressing that particular topic is going to become. I want to thank you for maybe nodding your head at a couple of examples that I put in front of you. And I'm really looking forward to the conversation that we can have about this that I presented to you today. Thank you.
So I think we can take about 10 or 15 minutes for questions.
Thank you very much. That was so stimulating. I'm Judith Buchanan from the University of York, and licensed by your talk to think with and through examples. I wonder if we could just go back for a minute to that really interesting distribution of if, ands, and buts across Shakespeare's work, and the way in which you identify the anomalous placement of Othello
Yes.
Within that spread, and that you offer an interpretation of that anomalous placement as indicative of the ways in which the forms and cadences of Othello in some ways mimic the processes and modalities of comedy. And so there's a sort of generic slippage there. And that I understand that and I get that and I feel the truth of that. No. But
comic.
But I wonder whether that slightly limits the capacity for Shakespearean tragedy to be more accommodating in the kinds of premises it is predicated upon. So, for example, in the ways in which Pyramus and Thisbe can be the condition of a skittish comedy and also then become the central tenet of Romeo and Juliet, cannot the fact of an if be a normal condition of comedy that let's speculate, let's build our lives around conditional clauses and possibilities, and then that very possibility becomes the thing that tragedy is predicated upon in Othello, so that when in the big scene in the middle of Othello, when Iago and Othello walk in and perhaps they see Cassio slipping away, perhaps guilty-like, and Iago has that incomplete conditional clause, or if incomplete, I know not what, and that he is a man who can accommodate the impish and evil possibility of a conditional clause, and he knows that Othello is a man, as a soldier, who cannot handle the incomplete possibility and therefore seeks resolution, even if the resolution is going to be self-destructive. And so the brilliance of Othello is it takes the condition of what might have been a comedy and it turns it into the central thing, a man's incapacity to handle a conditional clause that's going to bring him down.
So that was a virtuoso example of redescription, and I like your interpretation better than mine.
Oh.
So perhaps the step back from this is that what we call comic and tragic playwriting and dramaturgy, which is essentially up to us because we've made up the labels, is actually shorthand for a set of tendencies, and that a writer like Shakespeare is at every moment projecting a tendency of where he's going and then tacking counter. A great example is Lear. When you have a more sophisticated classifier for the linguistic structure of comedy, pieces of Lear just jump out as being some of the most comic things Shakespeare ever wrote. That's because writing tragedy isn't a kind of formula that you tick the boxes for. It's a set of projected possibilities, and playwrights, to write great plays, are projecting the possibilities and then frustrating and confirming them. How does it happen on the ground? And what's the summary of a play like Othello? It's a story about a man who couldn't deal with if. Pretty good.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Hi, thank you so much for such a stimulating talk. I'm Margot Browning from the University of Chicago. I'm really curious about training artificial intelligence on a humanities curriculum. And I thought, well, I mean, Alan Turing talks in his article from 1950 on, if I'm getting the date right, on artificial intelligence, thinking about it training a child, you know, that's how we would train a machine. So there's that data point out there. So it seems like one issue for a humanities curriculum or a liberal arts curriculum for a machine would be the Chinese room problem, because is it supposed to, will we understand it as understanding? But, you know, that seems to be at the heart of what we want, for example, undergraduates to do in humanities, is to understand.
To really understand.
To really understand.
Yeah, right.
Not just to give us output. So I was wondering, do you know of any situations where machines are being trained on a humanities curriculum? Or if you do or don't, would you care to speculate on first steps?
So I don't, and we should create the curriculum now. I think that is a vital task, and it's the reason we should do it, along with other people, is that canon formation and exemplarity have been the internal guideposts for the creation of curriculum for hundreds of years. So the canon for robots probably is not substantively different from the ideal canon for 21-year-olds. But it does require that someone say what is in scope for the required ideal training corpus. Are you reading Gibbon? Are you reading, what is it? And how many languages are being explored? I'm not sure I know the right answer to the Chinese room problem, because I can't tell when a student nods, do you really get why this is an if play? But it's as close as we're going to get. And you know, so my answer to your question is the big issue is who creates that canon, and the answers to that question are humanities questions that we have been debating for decades, and we should get to work on it for machines.
I feel a real generation gap in these conversations in my own department and even here. But I love what you said about confirmation bias and redescription. And I was focused on that slide with, you know, Turk and Jew in the masculine vice quadrant, and Southern Europeans in the virtue female quadrant, and your conclusion that there's a feminization of Southern Europe. And I thought instead what I saw was the absence of female Jews, which we know is the case in this corpus.
Yep, absolutely right.
And in fact, it's a moment of highly feminized Jewish masculinity, that Jewish men were imagined to have menstruated, that it's simply the presence of the Jew in the quadrant of he is because they're men, not masculine. So just a...
and a great example of how what's omitted from the corpus shapes the bias halo that is retrieved from the analysis. The gappiness of these corpora and the inability to talk about certain subject positions or certain historical realities or lived realities is really important. I will offer an example that may be a nice counter to that. There's a wonderful scholar named Ruth Annert who has been doing correspondence networks in Tudor culture, most of which have been studied by humanists in terms of who wrote the letter and who it was to. But if you do a network analysis of that, but then also of the people named in the letters, what you realize is that these political networks that were developing at the end of the 16th century were centered around women who were mentioned in the letters and were then the collecting points for these coteries of radicals who were then, and they weren't appearing in the DNB and these other entries. So that's a good example of an omission. And you have to say that these gappy corpora, like Igbo TCP, is published texts. What about what's in manuscript? What about oral culture? I only have a snippet of oral culture from a Justice of the Peace's deposition of a rural woman from Warwickshire. There's a lot of information in there that would be completely swamped in this large corpus, which is not representative of the full range of human experiences in the period.
Yes, Amanda Anderson, Brown University. Could you go back to the two recommendations, the problem factory
Yep.
And the train AI? Okay. So that was an incredibly rich and thought-provoking talk. I found myself thinking about a certain tension between the AI emphasis on confirmation and the humanities emphasis on ambiguity, open-ended inquiry. Not sure whether it's asymptotic in your view or not. Probably not.
No, it's endless in my
It's endless, right, exactly. And kind of dissatisfied, in the sense, right.
Yep.
And I was wondering, so that all, I understand that, though I was thinking about, first of all, how confirmation is playing in your own example of if, and but, because it's really kind of confirming complexity. I mean, that's right, via the if and the but.
Yes.
So it's sort of like the perfect humanities AI example. But when you were talking about but when you were talking about the problem factories, I was a little uncertain. It was really striking to me, the set of things that you said in relation to that. It seemed to me, on the one hand, that you wanted to kind of challenge the AI folks to confirm complex claims, right? Or to fail to confirm them so that it's kind of trickery. It's like, and now we're going to be able to talk about power, privilege, culture, and history because you're going to fail to confirm this claim about possessive individualism.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not sure that's what you were saying, but the end goal there is the kind of the complex conversation that ensues. But then I wonder, how could you possibly ever train AI on a humanities curriculum? Like just the tension between those two. And then just one little teeny other moment in the talk that I think is relevant. When you said, where translation fails, there history and culture lies, I was really struck because it seemed to also play into the idea that somehow central to this encounter is the failure of AI and the lesson to be learned there.
Right.
So anyway, those are a set of
that's a
observations
complex
as a
set
question.
of. Yeah. Well, so I take from that, if we break their machines, we'll prove that our problems are really complicated, and we'll break open, and we will start conversations about possibly the failure of our own generalizations, which need to be more nuanced. We will see the pervasive bias and blindness of the way history is recorded and then interpreted. Those all seem like positive outcomes from a humanities standpoint. I don't think it would actually irritate the machine learning community that much. You know, scientists, when scientists give papers, they show slides and they say, this is what I think today. And when I started going to conferences and reading with computer scientists, and you read off the page, our epistemological profile in the humanities is of speaking now and forever. These are the things I believe in are true. It's a writing-based culture. I think that knowledge community is more comfortable with provisionality than we are, actually. And if we started giving talks entirely orally, then our research culture would become more comfortable with revision on the fly through community interaction. So I think that's a bias within the humanities that this type of work shows up. If we see the failure of the machine and the failure of our models, I mean, a failure with respect to what? It's a failure with respect to a publishing horizon that lasts 100 years out, and I'm right now, and I'll also be right 100 years from now. It's not a failure in the context of a conversation where data is being used to explore a problem space and a problem. That said, I think I still feel like a Raymond Williams cultural studies person when an algorithm like this finds bias and can even show a hierarchy, gender being the most pervasive, maybe confession and religious affiliation next, maybe region and dialect next. I think it's okay if there's an ordered hierarchy of biases that can be described empirically as a result of people's practices. And that's why I'm not a Platonist. That's just the way I see the world. It's because I was trained by neo-Marxists, but I have added a couple of things to the way I think about the world. But I don't think the humanities should be afraid of a finding that says, we've looked at this corpus and it really seems like the areas where you're getting the greatest variability because there's the most ideological intensity is around gender. Or the way Laura Mulvey could say, I think that scopophilic masculinity is expressed in first-person camera shots as opposed to subject to being full camera scene. That was an algorithmic argument. And Cinemetrics went and said, yeah, that's really how it works. But that's certainly not the end of the conversation. And if Cinemetrics says, Laura Mulvey was really onto something when she started to talk about scopophilia and the formal properties of classic Hollywood cinema, that's part of our practice too. I'm not sure that was a good answer to your, okay, yes?
Basically, people have established these readings or understandings of how race and gender and sexuality is working. And then, any of us who've read tons and tons of text can talk about Randy Goetz, Mahorn, the way monkeys work, et cetera, in this discourse. So close reading and reading lots and lots of text, not just one, but lots of text, allowed Kim Hall and a bunch of people to make these arguments. So what I struggle with is how, these resources actually do make is it new knowledge when it does seem to be confirming in relationship to how much scale is scale. Yeah. So if people read hundreds of text and then through close reading they produce this information versus we do this in relationship, because it's still this question between empiricism. People have been doing this work through close reading for a very long time. So then that just sort of makes me struggle with how this is really doing something that produces something new in terms of knowledge. And Mulvey's a really interesting example, right? Because actually, yes, she was picked up, but then a whole bunch of other people said no. Very quickly, actually, and had all these other ways of sort of interpreting things. Because when we go to the problem factory question, I'm unclear that the attempt to describe style, is something that can be produced in relation to these data sets. And I depend on data sets when I look at I'm doing media analysis. I'm trying to
Yeah.
look at recurrence of words, et cetera, but then I have to read them.
We're going to need to wrap up, so we're going to make this the last question and give you just a few minutes.
A great question. I think your first point, which is that Kim Hall figured this out by reading Othello and not 30,000 other texts, is the first headline. Humanities is very, very powerful. And maybe Othello is a special example because of the layering of religious, sexual, racialized forms of belonging. And as a stacked set of propositions, it's even more important to us. So I think that's the first headline. The second, suppose the people who disagree with Laura Mulvey went through a database of shots and shot-by-shot analysis of classic Hollywood film and said, yes, but this other thing is true too. Where are we? Well, we're right in the middle of humanities argument because that's an argument that's already happened. On the question of how data is used to confirm alternate hypotheses, I think one of the things that's interesting about machine learning is that it assumes that human behavior is multidimensional and that power or style or anything else is active on a number of layers which cannot be fully disentangled. Why do I say that? Because you could pick other axes through those vector embedding models and find support for other interpretations of early modern culture because you chose a different axis. I don't think that's a problem from the machine learning standpoint because the starting point is this is a phenomenon that is so multidimensional it can't be exhausted. You tell me what the important problems are. And if I were in the problem factory, I don't think I would become particularly nervous that one of the models, while confirming one set of perceptions, didn't confirm another set that seem equally viable and ought to be explored. And in that way, maybe it's just a prosthetic, and your question of whether there's any new knowledge here is a real one.
On that note, please join me in
Thank you.